You know, people ask me all the time, Stan, how did you come up with Iron Man? And I always smile because the truth is, Iron Man wasn't supposed to work. He was a gamble, a crazy, audacious gamble that could have destroyed my career. But let me back up a little bit here because you need to understand where Marvel was in 1963 to understand why creating Tony Stark was either the smartest or the stupidest thing I ever did. It was early 1963 and we were on fire. Spider-Man had just exploded. The Fantastic Four were selling like hotcakes. The Hulk was finding his audience. Thor was bringing mythology to life. We'd cracked the code. Make heroes human. Give them problems. Make them relatable. Readers didn't want perfect gods anymore. They wanted heroes who struggled, who failed, who had bad days just like them. But I had this itch, this nagging feeling that we were playing it safe. Sure, our heroes had problems. Peter Parker couldn't pay rent. Bruce Banner was tortured by his own power. Thor was trapped in a mortal body, but they were still fundamentally good people, underdogs, the little guy fighting the system. And that was great, that was working, but what if we tried something different? What if we created a hero that readers were supposed to hate? I remember sitting in that cramped office on Madison Avenue, looking out at the city and thinking about the world we were living in. This was 1963, right? The Cold War was at its peak. The Vietnam War was ramping up. America was terrified of communism, obsessed with capitalism, and we were building weapons like they were going out of style. Defense contractors were making billions. The military-industrial complex was this unstoppable machine. And I thought, what if our next hero was part of that machine? Now let me tell you something about comic book heroes in 1963. They were scientists, or soldiers, or regular people who got caught in accidents. They were humble. They were altruistic. They fought for justice and the American way. They definitely weren't rich industrialists who made their fortune selling weapons to the government. That would be insane, right? That would be like asking readers to root for the guy they were supposed to distrust, the capitalist, the warmonger, the embodiment of everything the counterculture was starting to rebel against. And that's exactly why I wanted to do it. I called up Don Heck, one of our artists, and I said, Don, I want to create a hero who's everything readers should hate. A billionaire, an arms dealer, a playboy, someone who profits from war. And there was this long pause on the other end of the line. Finally, Don said, Stan, are you feeling okay? But here's the thing, and this is what nobody understood at first. I didn't want to create a villain. I wanted to create a hero who had to overcome his own worst instincts. See, anybody can be heroic when they start from nothing. It's easy to root for the underdog, but what about the guy who has everything? The guy who's already on top? Can he be a hero? Should he be? That was the challenge. That was the experiment. So we started building Tony Stark, and let me tell you, every choice we made was deliberate. He had to be a genius, but an arrogant genius. He had to be handsome, but shallow. He had to be rich, filthy rich, obscenely rich. And most importantly, he had to make his money from war. I remember writing the first issue, and I kept thinking, this is either going to revolutionize superhero comics or it's going to be the biggest disaster of my career. Because here's what we were doing. We were taking this symbol of corporate America, this weapons manufacturer, and we were going to make readers care about him. The origin story had to be perfect. We couldn't just give him powers and call it a day. His transformation had to mean something. It had to be redemptive. So we sent Tony Stark to Vietnam. Now, this was controversial even then, but it was necessary. Vietnam was where America's moral certainties were crumbling. It was where the costs of war were becoming impossible to ignore. And that's where Tony Stark needed to go, to the place where his weapons were actually being used, where he could see the consequences of his choices. We had him demonstrating his new weapon, ironically called a miniature transistorized weapon, because everything was about transistors in the 60s. And then, boom, he steps on a booby trap. Shrapnel tears through his chest, heading straight for his heart. And this is where it gets interesting. Tony Stark, the man who built weapons to kill, was about to be killed by a weapon. Not even one of his own, just the brutal reality of war. The thing he'd been profiting from was about to destroy him, but we didn't kill him. Instead, we gave him a second chance. Or really, we gave him a curse disguised as a second chance. The Viet Cong captured him. We had this character, Wong Chu, the local warlord, and they forced Tony to build weapons for them. But here's the brilliant part, and I'm not sure readers fully understood it at first. Tony Stark was dying. That shrapnel was still in his chest, moving toward his heart with every passing hour. He had days, maybe a week to live. And what does he do? Does he build the weapon they demanded? Does he try to escape? No. He builds a suit of armor with an electromagnetic chest plate to keep the shrapnel from reaching his heart. He builds something to save his own life. He chooses survival, but, and this is crucial, he doesn't just save himself. He uses that armor to escape, to fight back, to destroy the weapons caches. In his moment of greatest vulnerability, facing death, Tony Stark has his first genuinely heroic act. Not because it's profitable, not because it advances his business interests, because it's right. That's when Tony Stark becomes Iron Man. Not when he puts on the armor, but when he chooses to use it for something bigger than himself. Now, I've got to tell you about the armor design, because this was where Don Heck and Jack Kirby really earned their paychecks. The first armor, the original gray suit, it wasn't sleek, it wasn't sexy. It looked like a walking tank, like something cobbled together in a cave, which is exactly what it was. Some people said it was ugly. And yeah, it was, but it was supposed to be. This wasn't some gift from the gods or some elegant mutation. This was survival technology. This was a man building a life support system out of spare parts and desperation. Later, we gave him the gold armor, then the iconic red and gold. We made it sleeker, more heroic looking. But that first design, that clunky, brutal gray suit, that was the most honest version. That was Tony Stark at his most vulnerable, building something to keep his heart beating. And speaking of his heart, let's talk about that chest plate. Because this wasn't just a cool visual element. This was Tony Stark's daily reminder of his mortality. Every single day he had to charge that chest plate. Every day he was reminded that he was one power failure away from death. Here's a billionaire who can buy anything, solve any problem with money, and the one thing he can't buy is a normal heart. The one thing he can't fix is the shrapnel lodged near his most vital organ. His greatest invention, the thing that made him Iron Man, was also his weakness. It was the thing slowly killing him. That's what made Tony Stark different from every other hero we'd created. Peter Parker could take off the Spider-Man suit. Bruce Banner desperately wanted to stop being the Hulk. But Tony Stark, he was trapped in his armor. It wasn't just a costume, it was a cage. A very expensive, very powerful cage, but a cage nonetheless. And let me tell you, the readers didn't know what to make of it at first. The letters started coming in after the first few issues, and they were mixed. Some people loved it. They loved the technology, the sophistication, the fact that Iron Man was different. But others, they hated Tony Stark. He's too rich, they said. He's too arrogant. Why should we care about a billionaire's problems? And I remember sitting in the office with Don and some of the other guys, reading these letters and thinking, good, that's exactly right. They're not supposed to like him immediately. They're supposed to struggle with him, just like he's struggling with himself, because that was the whole point. Tony Stark was a hero in progress. He wasn't Peter Parker, who was heroic from the start but just needed confidence. Tony had to learn how to be heroic. He had to overcome his own nature. In those early stories, we kept showing his flaws. He was dismissive of people. He treated women like accessories. He was obsessed with his company, with making money. His secretary, Pepper Potts, was in love with him, and he barely noticed. His driver, Happy Hogan, was loyal to him, and Tony treated him like hired help. But slowly, very slowly, we started showing the change. The transformation wasn't dramatic. It wasn't instant. It was gradual, realistic. Tony started caring about the people around him. He started using his technology not just for profit, but for protection. He started questioning the weapons business that had made him rich. And this is where the genius of Iron Man's character really emerged. He was a hero who had to fight himself as much as he fought villains. His greatest enemy wasn't the Mandarin or the Crimson Dynamo or any of the colorful villains we threw at him. His greatest enemy was his own ego, his own greed, his own tendency to think he could solve everything with money and technology. We gave him an alcohol problem later, not in those first issues, but it was always lurking in the background, because a man with that much pressure, that much responsibility, that much guilt, of course he'd turn to something to numb the pain. And when we finally did the Demon in a Bottle storyline years later, it felt inevitable. It felt true. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Back in 1963, we were just trying to make this character work, and the key was the armor. See, the armor wasn't just a weapon, it was a symbol. Every time Tony upgraded it, every time he added a new feature or refined the design, he was trying to solve his problems through technology. That was his superpower, really. Not the armor itself, but his belief that human ingenuity could overcome any obstacle. And sometimes he was right. The armor let him fly. It gave him strength. It protected him. It turned a dying man into one of the most powerful beings on earth. But sometimes he was wrong, because there are some problems technology can't solve. Loneliness, guilt, the weight of knowing your weapons have killed people, the knowledge that your fortune was built on destruction. Those problems required a different kind of heroism, the kind that comes from looking in the mirror and admitting you've been wrong, the kind that comes from choosing to be better. I wanted Tony Stark to represent something specific, the idea that redemption is possible, that you don't have to be born heroic, that you can start from a place of selfishness and greed and still become something noble. Because here's what I believed then, and still believe now. Heroes aren't born. They're made. They're made by the choices they face and the decisions they make. Tony Stark chose to build the armor instead of the weapon. He chose to escape instead of collaborate. He chose to fight instead of surrender. And later, he chose to stop making weapons altogether. He chose to use his genius for protection instead of destruction. Those choices defined him more than any superpower ever could. Now let me tell you about the Avengers, because Iron Man's role in that team was crucial to his development as a character. When we brought together Iron Man, Thor, Hulk, Ant-Man, and Wasp in the Avengers #1, Tony Stark was the financier. He was the one with the money, the one who could afford to maintain the team, to provide the equipment, to keep the whole operation running. And at first, that seemed like a minor detail, but think about what that meant. Tony Stark was using his fortune, the fortune he made from weapons, to fund a team of heroes. He was literally converting his war profits into peacekeeping. That was his atonement. That was his way of balancing the scales. And within the Avengers, Tony was often the voice of pragmatism. Thor had his nobility, Cap had his idealism, but Tony was the guy who asked the hard questions. How are we going to pay for this? What's our long-term strategy? What happens when the world turns against us? He was the businessman in a group of warriors and idealists, and sometimes that made him seem cold, calculating, but other times it made him the only one thinking clearly. The dynamic between Iron Man and Captain America became one of my favorite things to write. Here's Steve Rogers, this man from the 1940s, with his black and white morality and his unwavering principles. And then there's Tony Stark, this modern man who sees the world in shades of gray, who understands compromise and complexity. They respected each other, but they didn't always agree. And that tension, that fundamental difference in worldview, it made both characters richer. Because Tony learned from Steve. He learned that principles matter, that some lines shouldn't be crossed, that there's value in idealism. And Steve learned from Tony. He learned that the world had changed, that solutions weren't always simple, that sometimes you had to work within the system to change it. But I'm getting ahead of myself again. Let me bring this back to the beginning, to that fundamental question. Could I make readers love a billionaire? And the answer, after all these years, is yes. But not in the way I originally expected. Readers didn't love Tony Stark because he was rich. They loved him despite his wealth. They loved him because underneath the money and the armor and the arrogance, he was broken. He was flawed. He was trying. They loved him because he represented second chances, because he showed that you could come from privilege and still be heroic, that your past didn't have to define your future, that redemption was always possible if you were willing to do the work. And let me tell you something about the real genius of Iron Man, something that I think even I didn't fully appreciate at the time. Iron Man proved that Marvel's formula could work with any character, no matter how unlikely. Spider-Man was relatable because he was poor. Iron Man was relatable because he was human. The specifics of their circumstances didn't matter as much as the core truth. They were people with problems, real, genuine problems that couldn't always be solved by punching a villain. Tony Stark had to battle his own demons, his ego, his addiction, his fear of intimacy, his guilt over the weapons he'd created, and readers responded to that because everyone has demons. Everyone has parts of themselves they're not proud of. Everyone struggles with whether they're good enough, whether they deserve to be loved, whether they can be better than they are. Iron Man said, yes, you can be better. You can change. It's hard, it's painful, you'll fail sometimes, but you can change. That's a powerful message, especially coming from a character who started as the hero you're supposed to hate. Years later, when Robert Downey Jr. brought Tony Stark to life in the movies, I watched that first film and I got chills because Robert understood. He got what we were trying to do all those years ago. He brought that same complexity, that same mix of arrogance and vulnerability, that same journey from selfishness to sacrifice. And when Tony Stark snapped his fingers in Endgame, when he used the Infinity Stones knowing it would kill him, that was the culmination of a journey that started in a cave in Vietnam in 1963. From a man who built armor to save his own life, to a man who gave his life to save the universe. That's character development. That's the arc we dreamed of when we first created him. But even back then, in those early days, we knew we had something special. We knew that Tony Stark represented something important. The idea that heroism isn't about where you start. It's about where you're willing to go. You want to know why I created Iron Man? I created him because I wanted to prove that anyone could be a hero, not just the underdogs, not just the common man, but even the people we're taught to distrust, even the billionaires, the arms dealers, the corporate types. Because if Tony Stark could become a hero, if he could transcend his origins and his flaws and become something noble, then maybe anyone could. Maybe we all could. That was the gamble. That was the bet I made in 1963 when I pitched a billionaire arms dealer superhero to Martin Goodman and watched his face go pale. And you know what? I'd make that bet again in a heartbeat, because Iron Man taught me something I've carried through every character I've created since. People don't want heroes they can idolize. They want heroes they can become. They want to see themselves, their flaws, their struggles, their potential reflected back at them in four-color glory. Tony Stark was rich, arrogant, and morally compromised, but he was also brilliant, courageous, and willing to change. He was a work in progress, just like all of us. And that's why, after 60 years, Iron Man still matters. Not because of the armor, not because of the technology, not because of the wealth, but because underneath all of that, there's a man with a damaged heart trying to do the right thing. That's a story that never gets old. That's a story worth telling. And that's why I created Iron Man, to make readers love a billionaire. Because love isn't about perfection. It's about seeing someone's flaws and believing in their potential to be better. Iron Man is proof that belief was justified. And maybe, just maybe, that's the most heroic thing about him. Excelsior.